podcast today. And in just a second, I'm going to go ahead and introduce the panelists. I'm Steve Tremitiere. I'm going to be moderating the panel today. And the topic for today's session is all about the emerging revolution of voice tech in healthcare. And what we're going to do once I do the intros is we're actually going to provide a little bit of the background of the development of speech technology, because I think most people don't really know what sits behind all the tech we're seeing today. So Jeff's going to be kind enough to walk us through a brief history. And then I'm going to get into a session with the three panelists where we're going to talk about both the current state of speech tech in healthcare, and then talk about what we see is to come. So if you have questions, please put them in the chat, and I'll keep an eye on the chat so that when we get to the end, we should have some time for Q&A, and we'll go ahead and tee those questions up. But in the meantime, let me go ahead and do intros. So Jeff Adams is the CEO of Cobalt Speech and Language. And Jeff really is a pioneer. He's a leading figure in the world of commercial speech technology. He's managed top-level speech and language technology research for more than 25 years. That includes at Kurzweil AI, Nuance, /Dragon, Yap, and Amazon. And he's also the founder of Cobalt Speech and Language and a co-founder of Canary Speech. He led the teams that developed the core technology for Dragon Naturally Speaking, Yap Voicemail, and Amazon Alexa. At Cobalt, Jeff has assembled a team of elite speech scientists and engineers to build custom apps to meet the needs of their clients. Jeff is the author of 25 patents and several published research papers, and serves on the board of several companies. Next up is Sandra Powell-Elliott, and Sandra is the VP of Innovation and Ambulatory Ventures at Hackensack Meridian Health in New Jersey. Sandra's role at Hackensack Meridian is to develop and foster internal development of an innovative culture and bring innovative and transformative solutions from outside of the organization to the forefront of the organization's strategic planning efforts. The scope of the internal and external innovation she's responsible for spans the breadth of precision medicine, new device development, new product and solution development, new business model development, as well as new, more efficient ways to operate the business units within an integrated health network. That's a big job, Sandra. She also oversees the development of a genomic reference lab and an ambulatory imaging joint venture. Excuse me. Sandra is involved in emerging research-based entities on the campus of Hackensack Meridian Health School of Medicine and the Center for Discovery and Innovation in Nutley, New Jersey. She regularly speaks at national conferences and has published many articles in publications such as Trustee Magazine, the Journal of Healthcare Financial Management, Future Age Hospitals and Health Networks, and The Health Strategist. And last is Henry O'Connell, the CEO and co-founder of Canary Speech. Henry began his career after graduate school working at the NIH in a neurological disease group, and then has been on the business side for the last 25 years. He's successfully accomplished several turnarounds in the tech space. He has 20 years of C-level corporate management with experience at Gilson, HP, and Moxtech, among others. And he sits on several boards serving both the private and public sector. He's also worked worldwide managing companies, including North America, Europe, and Asia. And he, as I said, is the founder and CEO of Canary Speech. So now that we have the intros out of the way, I want to jump into a little presentation that we put together around the history of speech technology first of all, speech technology in general, and then how it relates to health. So I'm going to turn it over to Jeff Adams to go ahead and walk us through this brief history. Go ahead, Jeff.
Thank you, Steve. First of all, I'm intimidated by having to cover all of speech technology. That's like saying cover all of technology. Tell us the history there. Speech technology is a broad term that includes all sorts of things, but includes getting machines to understand you, getting machines to talk, getting machines to carry on a conversation, take appropriate actions. And I'll give you some highlights of some of those, but let me start by looking at speech synthesis. That is getting machines to speak. I can't speak. back in the 19th century, people were making, and 18th century, people were making mechanical speech synthesizers. Way back as far as like the mid 1800s, you can see there's a picture here of this mechanical device that you'd have to manipulate this little opening with your hand, and there's a special little lever to make a sh sound and so forth. Fast forward to 1939, the first electronic synthesizer called Voder was debuted. And let's go to the next slide. And then more recently, if you're old like me, you'll remember in the 1980s, Texas Instruments Speak and Spell, where you could type out a word and it would speak it to you. And then in the 80s, also the first reading machines for the blind made by Kurzweil were debuted, where you could use optical character recognition to read text on a page and it would then speak it to you. Since the 1980s, synthesis has really improved. I should say, back in the 80s, you could understand what it was speaking, but it sounded like Stephen Hawking. It was he hasn't upgraded his technology since the 80s, but since then it has gotten a lot better by the use of hidden Markov models, deep neural networks, and other kinds of advancements, so that now it's more or less indistinguishable from human voice. Let me jump over to speech recognition, right? This is the problem of getting computers to understand what you're saying. In the 1950s, the first speech recognizers were introduced. And in those early days, they had recordings of each word that they could recognize, and a word would come in and they would try to match it to that recording, essentially. In the 1980s, this took a great leap forward with hidden Markov models and a more of a phonemic-based recognizer, where it was smart enough to recognize the individual sounds of the words that you were saying, and then could match those sounds with a catalog of words that it knew what sounds were in those words. But that was still, it required you to speak individual words separated like this. In the 90s, you had the first successful commercial speech recognizers. The big three were from IBM, Dragon, and Kurzweil, and I was lucky to work for Kurzweil and Dragon. That was a heady time, and that's also when the recognition could start understanding connected speech, where you didn't have to pause between the words. Everybody took notice in like 2009, 2010, when like Siri was introduced, and suddenly everybody was talking to their devices. And then later, a few years later in 2014, when Alexa was rolled out, and then soon after that, Google Assistant and so forth. And now it's quite common for people to speak to their machines, and not just speak to their machines, but also expect the machines to not just recognize and be able to spell the words, but understand what they mean and figure out how to act on that and so forth. There's a third kind of speech technology that I think is super important, and we'll talk a little bit about today, and that is speech analytics. And the idea with speech analytics is that I can analyze not just the words that you're saying, but what your voice says about you. And that might be paying attention to the words you use, but more sophisticatedly, is that a word? I'll say it anyway. It's analyzing what the sound of your voice says about you. I could tell by listening to you, if you could hear me but not see me right now, you might be able to infer certain things about my age, my gender, where I'm from originally. You might be able to tell if I'm energetic or tired or whatever. One of the main players in this space, I'm just reading my slide here, one of the main players in this space is Canary speech. And this is one I'm most excited about, which promises to use these speech biomarkers to assess health conditions. And that could be depression, Alzheimer's, congestive heart failure, Parkinson's, all sorts of conditions that we can tell when you go to the doctor, and you talk to the doctor's not just looking at your pupils and so forth and taking your pulse. The doctor's paying close attention to how you speak. Is your speech slurred? Are you using appropriate words? Things like that. And we're getting to the point where machines are starting to be smart enough to do that kind of analysis as well. All right, Steve, I think that does it. I'm going to turn it back to you.
Great. And hopefully that took the share off the screen. Did it?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay. All right. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to give Jeff a little bit of a break, and I'm going to first of all, thank you for doing that, Jeff. I realize that since we're talking about speech, I'm very careful about everything I'm saying. I'm hyper aware. So I'm going to first turn to Sandra, because we have an industry pioneer and a technologist, we have an entrepreneur and a business builder, and we have an implementer and an innovator, who has to make things work, on the ground. And so I'm going to ask each of you to give us a couple minutes on how you view the current state of speech technology in healthcare, and then we'll get into a little back and forth. But Sandra, would you go first, please?
Yeah, sure. And thank you, Jeff. That was a great overview. I was actually thinking, gosh, I didn't realize you could do that in 5 or 6 slides. You did a great job. But I think, kind of thinking about some of the evolution of the technology itself, I think there are kind of 3 core use cases from a clinical perspective. And when you're thinking about it from a health delivery perspective, a health system perspective, or any kind of provider of health and wellness, there are kind of 3 areas that we see voice technology really coming into play. One is in that patient engagement and kind of enhancing the ability of the patient to engage with the health system. And I'll come back to that in just a moment. Well, let me go ahead and kind of focus in on that. I think one of those elements is really kind of thinking about the Amazon Alexa mindset of how can I talk to a device to get an easy answer to a question, whether that is, should I go to the emergency room given my symptoms, or should I go to an urgent care center, for example, and interacting in an easy way with making it, kind of simple. You don't need to know computer technology. You just need to know how to speak and have a device that can interpret. So I think patient access and that experience is kind of one use case as an example. And there are a lot around, kind of that patient experience and engagement perspective that you can really kind of begin to imagine. The second one that immediately comes to mind is really, how do we leverage voice technology and speech technology to facilitate processes, right? So some of that is very kind of AI and ML oriented, but I'm thinking about, a lot of things, for example, that Jeff mentioned with Dragon Speaking, and just trying to leverage voice technology to make it easier for a clinician to document what they're doing. Of course, we've been doing this in imaging and other areas like pathology and those kinds of things. But then how do we leverage that same type of technology and interaction, adding more computers, kind of savvy to it in the background, and say, as a clinician, can I actually just go in, have a conversation with a patient, and automatically document my interaction with that patient as a result of that, versus having to sit in front of a computer and type in information. And I think the third, which is something that Jeff alluded to as well, and that we're super excited about, is how do I leverage speech and what the body does to create and emit speech and sound and voice in a way that helps us better understand clinically what's going on with that patient and the different types of use cases that can come from that. So, for example, can I listen to somebody give an answer to a couple of questions and or articulate a sentence and know whether or not they're going to have an acute exacerbation of a chronic condition such as CHF or a pulmonary condition, or is their Parkinson's beginning to get worse, or are they stable? And if you think about it from both a diagnostic perspective, a monitoring perspective, and even on diagnostics from the standpoint of a companion with a therapeutic, you can begin to understand whether or not a particular medication may be stabilizing a particular patient's condition from that standpoint by simply, paying attention and analyzing their voice. So we're super excited about the clinical implications, as well as some of the operational opportunities it creates to help us engage with our patients differently and facilitate a fast, a more efficient workplace. But most importantly is that, it's hard to understand the implications, but exciting nonetheless to think about how much we can do with voice to provide a clinical support structure for providers and, most importantly, the patients out in the community. So we're super excited about that area in particular.
Great, thank you. And just like Jeff had to compress 100 years of speech technology, you had to put a whole bunch into just a few minutes. And I've got a lot of follow-up questions that hopefully we'll get to some of them. Thank you. Henry, you want to go next and talk about your perspective on the current state of a speech tech in healthcare?
Sure, and building off of where Sandra was speaking to, the connection of, and this is Canary Speech is Focused, the connection of speech technology and the analysis of speech biomarkers to create better connectivity between a clinical team and a patient, whether that individual patient is morning of a visit in a clinic or monitoring their conditions across time longitudinally and in a remote site, such as their home or otherwise. Connecting clinical centers with remote geographies that may not have adequate coverage. We're currently working with Ulster Hospital in Dublin, Ireland, connecting a population of individuals that are remote from site. We're also working with Tala Hospital, where they're monitoring the progression of disease over many years for cognitive health. So those kind of connectivities are so critical. Why voice offers such an opportunity to enhance that connection and to go from point of care to longitudinally providing data between those points of care to enhance the information that a clinical team has in the treatment of an individual, such as Sandra was talking about. Is the therapeutics or the treatment protocol that we have effective with this particular patient? And as we monitor them between visits, do we see that? And can voice provide that kind of information? We believe it can. The other wonderful thing about voice is the density of information that is in our voice. It's the most complex motor function that we produce. I have often said to people that of the data that the human body creates, voice is probably second only to the genome. It is a very dense, very complex set of information that if we're using the tools available to us in partnership with clinical centers so that we properly validate and model against certain targeted conditions, we can provide information in a non-invasive way from a stream of data that is conversational speech. Very easy to capture, can be captured over smart devices, either tablets or phones. And in telemedicine centers, it's a wonderful way to enrich the information we gather from individuals when we're in the call with them anyway. So those are the range of things that we believe that speech can enhance the quality of information and expand on the connectivity between patients and their clinical teams, and then provide for enhancing the quality of life and quality of care.
Great.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Henry. Jeff, your view of the current state.
The current state of speech tech, specifically with respect to healthcare, look, we've been helping, as Sandra mentioned, we've been helping caregivers, doctors and nurses dictate document their visits for decades. That's not new. That's still there. That'll get better. There'll be improvements. But where there are some improvements, I'd say there are two areas that I'm particularly excited about. One I already mentioned is Canary's and others, but Canary's use of voice analytics to help with understanding what's going on inside a patient. As Henry said, that voice is such a sophisticated trait that humans have, that it involves the the brain, the nerves, the muscles, the respiratory, the whatever. It involves so many parts of your body that when something is wrong somewhere, it leaves clues when you speak. And so that's exciting to me. There's another area that's not so much with the patient, but just more directly serving the physician. And we're seeing a lot of interest in voice control and voice interaction with medical devices. So imagine, for example, a surgeon who's in surgery and they have some sophisticated imaging or whatever kinds of devices that they're interacting with. Their hands aren't always free to turn a knob or press a button or whatever. And so it's increasing, the more sophisticated they are and the more capable those machines are, the more you want a voice interface to be able to interact with those. And we at Cobalt Speech are actually working on a number of projects along those lines right now. That's exciting. So those are my 2 cents of where I think what it's exciting to see for voice in healthcare.
Great, thank you. And what I want to kind of circle back on for this section is the next section we're going to talk more about near-term future. But there's always this gap between what technology can do and what is actually doing now, right? What's happening. And Sandra, in your world, because things you can have all the bells and whistles in the world, but if people won't use it, you can't implement it and it won't work. So what are some of the keys that you're seeing to the successful use of voice tech right now in your world?
I think there's a couple of things that are probably first and foremost, just overcoming the challenges of the possibility, I think is part of the challenge, and really making good use case examples and business case examples as a result of it. So I don't want to lose sight of that, but I think one of the critical things is, particularly if it's in the clinical arena, is really defining very specifically one of the bigger pain points or the opportunities to facilitate better care. Pain points on the provider side from a clinical perspective, how hard it is to really know how well a patient is doing. So for example, with depression, anxiety, for example, particularly when it comes to long-acting medications or medications that may take a while to demonstrate an impact. So those are some of the areas, but I think most importantly, the biggest challenge and one of the greatest opportunities is working with those clinicians just to define very specifically what it would take, number one, for them to feel comfortable and confident in the data and the voice technology. So if it's a clinical study and moving through that clinical study in concert with those key physicians in a way that they can understand and comprehend, but they're also very focused in on very specific outcomes. So if it's readmission reduction, for example, it's a good example to really focus in on. If we are looking at how do we leverage voice technology to reduce readmissions for congestive heart failure patients, for example, you've got to begin to help them understand, as well as our own system, is that in order to do that, one is, yes, I may have a biomarker for CHF, but what is the magnitude of that CHF over time for that individual patient, but also for patients in general, and how predictive is it in nature that this patient is going to get worse? So I think breaking it down into core elements is really the critical factor. But first and foremost, it's the use case. Getting clinicians who have a specific desire to leverage new technology to make a difference in patient clinical outcomes. And if you can focus there and work your way back, you can begin to make the right, get people engaged, but also make the right business and operational use case for the technology.
So Sandra, I have a really quick follow-up question, but I'm going to warn Henry and Jeff. Henry, I'm going to ask you to just talk briefly about various applications of the technology. And Jeff, I'm going to ask you to talk about what Sandra said around confidence in the data, because I think that's, there's two aspects, right? There's the confidence on the clinician side, the confidence in the data, and then there's the patient's confidence in the technology, right? Sandra, how comfortable do patients seem to be? A lot of people have Siri or Alexa, they're using other voice assistants already. Does the acceptance of voice technology seem to be really catching on? How do you see that today?
I see them extremely interested, and I do see that there's a desire to utilize the technology because it's so easy. Number one, I think the device that is used to collect that data, for example, a mobile phone, people feel a little bit more comfortable and confident in that because they don't feel like they can turn it on and off when they need to, for example, versus an in-home device like with Google Assistant and or Amazon Alexa. There's a different kind of component there. I think it's also they love the coolness of it, but I think if you use the analogy of what does a doctor do usually, or a nurse do every time that they're interacting with you? One of the first things that they do is they listen to you, right? Yeah. And if you use that as an example, that we're just using a different kind of device to get information and get sounds from the body, then they begin to understand kind of the base of where we're coming from. So for example, even with nurses, they'll tell you, if you could just speak to me, I can tell you whether or not your heart failure is getting worse or not, because I can tell if it's if you're sounding wet, for lack of a better analogy. And so it's interesting as long as you can get people to understand kind of that it's not just this random technology we're applying. This is how, basically medicine is started and one of the key tools that we've all used is stethoscope. That we're just doing it in a little different way and using a lot more of the technology that's available to better analyze that data.
Fantastic. Henry, we've talked about anxiety and depression already, and a couple of other use cases have come up. Can you just, just maybe a little more than list, but just, talk about a few of the areas where you're already doing work and where you see, we're going to talk more about the futures shortly, but where you already see a lot of interest in particular use cases and areas.
Well, as you said, anxiety, depression, stress, mood, those kind of things are things that individuals in and of itself are interested in and for their own personal lives, but are also things during their interactions with their clinical teams are things that often come up. The other area that's very interested is cognitive health, and particularly as we have populations around the world which are aging and people are living longer, cognitive health has become a much more top of stack item, and so for instance in Japan right now, Canary is engaged with both the Japanese government, their National Institute of Cerebral and Cardiovascular Health, and SNK, where we're looking at their annual health assessment. And in that case, one of the central elements of it is the cognitive health of an aging population. But at the same time, they look at things like anxiety and stress, and they look at depression, and they look at how people may feel loneliness in isolation in their homes. So those are all kind of important areas. And if we can successfully augment the information that individuals are getting, we can serve that population in a much more targeted and a much more quality way. So that's important. But we've talked about things like autism and providing, a screening for autism that could participate for their pediatricians or the general practitioner in helping to recognize early signs of that to get that individual into treatment earlier. And I think that's critical. Parkinson's disease, an area where a lot of work can be done and I think really value brought to that population. One of the other things you find, I've presented over the last month to 3 different groups on Alzheimer's and cognitive health. And one of the areas that's very interesting is what we call the worried well. So an individual who is caring for an Alzheimer's patient often is aging with them and likely has been with them for many, many years. As a companion to that individual, they often have two persistent worries that depreciate their own health status. And those worries are just heartbreaking. The one that I hear all the time is, I'm worried I won't live long enough to care for my companion to the end of their life. Really is the epitome of love, you know. And the second is they're concerned that they may be the next Alzheimer's patient. So providing them with a confidential, accurate mechanism to measure in the privacy of their own home their cognitive health can help reduce potentially the worry that they suffer under. And they're an invisible patient often, although that's getting much better in our healthcare system.
Great. Thanks, Henry. I mean, that should connect for everybody. At least one of those use cases, if not more, for sure. Jeff, so looking at all of this, and we talk about the data, right? Because we're producing incredible amounts of data from speech. Where do we stand right now in terms of the industry looking and saying we have this level of confidence in this data being accurate enough for us to be able to start to use it for diagnosis, et cetera?
Yeah, so that speaks to the whole issue of testing the different technologies as we're developing them, and that's a huge part. I mean, anybody can just create data, but if it's lousy data, that's not very helpful. And so what you have to do is whenever you're developing any technology, like I'm sure when Canary is developing technology, they do tests to cross-validate that with clinical data to make sure that the data coming from speech lines up and is verifiable as a trusted source of data. In some cases, that analytics data that we're getting automatically now is even more reliable than what we can get from other tests, because the other tests might be too invasive. I mean, there are certain things that you cannot really easily get at, like Alzheimer's. You can't really diagnose Alzheimer's without, MRIs and all sorts of tests, and that just may be prohibitive for the number of people you're trying to screen. And so then when you say, well, it's either using speech or not, or I'm just using some finger in the wind test that a clinician might use, the speech can be much more accurate than that kind of assessment. But we don't just say that. We have to prove it. We have to test it. We have to put it through rigorous testing and make sure that the correlations are there and make sure that we do have that confidence. I mean, I don't know how to say more than that. You're right that it is something that we have to worry about, and so we worry about it.
Are there use cases? Go ahead, Sandra.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that. I think, there's the value of the data itself and the source of the data and the fact that its accuracy. I think on the clinical side, one of the things that we have to be very careful about and work with companies in a way that we, particularly in the early stages, is making sure we understand, will that data change care options for a clinician, for example? So to us, that becomes extremely important once we have a certain confidence level that the data, the speech oriented data and the voice data is accurate, and then it can predict. We have to make sure that that prediction has an option. What is the value of that prediction? So going back to Alzheimer's, for example, it's knowing and understanding when the patient can potentially have, or is it early stage of Alzheimer's. We now have new clinical treatments that can help address and minimize the progression of that condition. And with voice, for example, we could monitor that. Previously, just as Jeff said, those are, diagnosing Alzheimer's is not easy. It's an art, and it does require a lot of high-end technology to help validate if best case scenario. So in that situation, it's a good example of, if we had something earlier, we have therapeutic options that we did not have in the past. there is huge value to changing outcomes. And I just want to keep bringing that back to fruition, because as I mentioned before, a lot of our patients feel like it's really cool stuff. The reality is, cool doesn't mean that, our lives are going to change. Cool and useful, is really where that kind of the mix is that we're looking for as a health provider. And I would really get people to really think about that as well, as they're looking at technology and using this technology, particularly in clinical arenas and their own environments.
Great. Henry or Jeff, either one of you want to follow up on that?
I think, consistent with what Sandra is saying, I think that the most appropriate and most successful way to develop these things is in concert with organizations like Hackensack Meridian, where you actually not just have peer review and well-conducted studies, but you also have the application of how those become useful to the clinical team in providing services to their clients, their patients. So that connectivity, that connection is an essential part to taking what we think is a useful tool and making it practical within the environment, getting past it's accurate, it's easy to get, it's kind of cool. As Sandra was saying, it's also useful and provides advantage to the patient. We get that done by working together,
Yeah, I think the word outcomes is the critical one there, and that really resonates. So I want to now move to kind of the next section, and again, I have to ask everybody to be brief but incredibly informative, if you can do that. And now I want to talk about the near term, and I'm going to say, let's talk about the next 3 to 5 years. And Henry, I'll go back to you first and talk about what you see happening over the next 3 to 5 years. And I would also we've been focusing mostly on the clinical side, which is absolutely fine, but I would love for you to also talk a little bit about what you're seeing in the wellness space as well, with the use of voice, because that's certainly another part of this where there's the opportunity for tremendous advancement.
Sure. We're functioning in a ever increasing rapid environment. All the wonderful tools we have allow us to remain connected. What we learned during the pandemic was you don't actually need to travel to a meeting. You can just stay in your seat and go from one meeting to the next. And now all of a sudden we could actually cram in 10 different meetings in a single day. All of that's created, from a wellness standpoint, all of that's created a situation, and our medical care centers have experienced this in alarming levels. And Sandra can speak to that, I'm sure, where our employees' level of stress, anxiety, and even PTSD is alarmingly high. In the case of voice as a wellness tool, where confidential assessments could be conducted, it could play an important role in providing information to individuals to not only self-manage, but also be connected through alerts and other means to information and things that can give them guidance on where do we go next. I think in the wellness space, employee health is an enormous one. In the remote, in an aging population, and this is virtually in every country we're working in right now, Steve, we're seeing an increasing concern for the aging population, our elder care, whether they're living in home or they're living in facilities, connecting them to families, which we can do through these voice types of connections, but also monitoring their health. So those are two areas that I think are just critical, and they're expanding now. What we'll see in the future from voice is that my hope is it becomes an integral, normal part of how we connect individuals around the world with respect to their own personal health and their clinical teams. And we do that in areas, such as the UN Innovation Center has, with respect to serving underserved populations and communities. All of this has to occur through the validation of these technologies and the use of those technologies in place in existing medical centers, I think. But then the rolling that out so that we have tremendous underserved populations around the world. And if we could extend this kind of technology where we're connecting a clinical center or a clinician with a truly remote population, that would be just amazing. So I guess that's my first thoughts.
Great. Jeff, from your perspective, where do you see the technology 3 to 5 years from now?
Well, I've already mentioned, I think I'm going to see, I look forward to seeing advances in voice control and interaction with medical devices, including maybe implanted medical devices, which, there's a challenge of getting appropriate interfaces there. And the analytics that I previously mentioned. There's another area that I'm kind of excited about that I think, and I hope will take off in the next 3 to 5 years. And that is voice technology supporting communications within a hospital, communications between caregivers and patients. That is, if I'm a nurse in a patient's room in the hospital, I would love, and I want to see that paired with wearables. I want to be able to have a wearable, if I'm a nurse, that I can say, what's this patient's history of X, or what's the status of the X-rays that we took 2 hours ago, or whatever, or to update some medical information about the patient. So I'd like to see that within a hospital and a communication center and the wearables, and I'd also like to see that between the doctor and the patient. That as Neil asked in the chat, that you can follow up with patients, make sure that they're that they're taking their medicines, that they're conforming to what's been asked. And while you're doing that, you can also listen to what they sound like and assess their health condition and so forth. So I'd like to see better integration with communications, which means better communications, as well as these other areas we've talked about.
Great. Sandra, I'm going to ask you, you can take off your implementation hat and put on a little bit of a dreamer hat and say, what would you love to see possible, in your system 5 years from now?
So obviously I've spent a lot of time talking on the clinical side, but I think, one of the things that Jeff mentioned in particular is making care and the delivery of care much more efficient. And there are so many ways to leverage voice technology to do that. And, I'm constantly still totally amazed at how hard it is when you are not part of a health system to just say, I need to have access to my EKG, not the report. I need the actual strip because I'm going to an ambulatory surgery center and they need it. How hard it is to actually still just get that. And as somebody in the health system, it's not easy and it's frustrating. And, it's got to be much easier for us to navigate the care. So I would love to see the hospital or health system of the future be so easy that you can actually just have a conversation and move care to that next level, whatever that next level is, whether it's getting all the information easily done that you need to get the next procedure you have, or as Jeff mentioned, making it easier for our clinicians who are at the bedside to really know what's going on with the patient and when they need to check up or potentially know when a result is coming back. Even when a patient is coming back to the floor, we still have problems if they're going out for imaging. We still have problems being efficient in communicating that. So I think, there's so much opportunity in the operations of health systems to leverage voice technology that there's tons of opportunity for entrepreneurs in that space, as well as in the clinical diagnostic and monitoring space, which I think will, in some respects, some of those elements will come sooner than later in both of those, because it'll just be easier to implement. But yeah, my future hat is it's got to be easy to interact with the health delivery system and the providers for patients to really get their needs met. And I think we've got a long way to go before we get there.
And having been a patient and a caregiver too often, over the years, that is, this also goes back to Neil's question, is, that seems from the patient, the caregiver side, that seems like that it shouldn't be as hard as it is, right? And certainly voice promises to do that, and it would be incredible if we can make that a reality where we really can speed up and make that communication process much more efficient. So we are now down to about the last 5 minutes or so. And if anybody else has any other questions, throw them in the chat. I've been getting a couple on the side here. This one is a quick technical one, and I think it's interesting because, Henry, you've already talked about some international implementations, but obviously when you think about speech and you think about language, and Hackensack's a perfect example, probably people walk in the hospital speaking 50 different languages, right? How does language play into this, or doesn't it? Either Henry or Jeff can answer this. So does it matter, like if Sandra has people coming in speaking many different languages, in the future, will you still be able to use these tools even if they're not speaking English?
Well, I'll let Jeff address some of this too, but the answer is yes and no. There are certain elements of the models we build that are language agnostic, but you would never deploy a model without validating its performance in the languages that you do. Now, validating it the second time, if you've built a model in one language, is easier. But then the interface itself has to, for instance, if you send them home with the interface, a smart device or a smart tablet, you need to be able to interface with them in that language. So it was Spanish or Armenian or German or Japanese. And so when we deploy in a particular nation, our interface to them, our app, if you will, is set up in their language. And Jeff can relate to this. I mean, Jeff's company, I think, is fluent in, I don't know how many languages, Jeff, now.
A dozen or so.
Yeah.
And Jeff, I know enough to know that, what you're doing, you're not looking at the words, right? You're looking below the level of the words, but maybe just talk about that briefly so people understand what you're actually analyzing.
Yeah, so it depends on what kind of voice technology you're talking about. If you're trying to help someone dictate a note at an encounter, you definitely need to understand the language to understand the words.
Right.
But if you're just looking at the, that makes it sound, if you're looking at the analytics to figure out what's going on in a health condition to use these biomarkers, it turns out many of the biomarkers don't have anything to do with language. They have to do with the rate of your speech, how much up and down and inflection you do, how much energy, how loudly you speak. There's a lot of little things that all contribute little bits of data that can be used to analyze what's going on. There are also, I don't know if I want to call them biomarkers, I'll call them lexomarkers. That is, there are clues in the words you speak. For example, in Alzheimer's, it turns out that people use fewer nouns and more adjectives. They can't think of the noun, so they start describing it with adjectives. And it's nice to be able to look at that, oh, this person has started using fewer nouns and more adjectives. That may be a warning sign. I've mentioned this to some people. Henry certainly knows, because I've talked to him about this story a lot. But one thing that got me interested in this field in the first place was hearing a report on the news that scientists had figured out from Agatha Christie's final books that she had Alzheimer's because her language started to change. And so, yeah, sometimes it can also help to pay attention to the words, but you don't have to. If we don't have, if someone's speaking a language we don't know, there is still information that we can get out of that. but there's more information if you do know the words, if you do know the language and can understand what they're talking about, especially if you're talking about things like depression or whatever. You can think about, you know, what is it they're saying, and how are they describing themselves and their situation and so forth.
Great. So there's one other question here from Jake, and I'm going to try. So it says, true conversational voice isn't a very new technology. Why do you think it hasn't been adopted, even though the value may be understood? And I think this partially goes towards what we were talking about back and forth communication and being able to just pick up on this. But you know, if anybody wants to comment on that question.
You know, go. You can, Jeff. Why don't you jump?
Okay. All right. Sorry, I don't want to dominate this, but honestly, true conversational voice is not very good. I mean, we learn how to talk to our devices. I'm constantly, telling Alexa to turn on the lights or whatever, but I can't say anything very sophisticated to her. I have to learn what I can say in order to get that, and I can't carry on a meaningful conversation, and it doesn't really understand what I'm doing. So it's not as sophisticated as all that. But there's another reason so that's one reason it isn't more widely adopted. But there's another reason, and that is that people have to get used to talking to devices. Where I think the biggest promise is in the near term is having computers sort of listen in on human-to-human conversations. Right. So I'm talking to my doctor, and there may be something listening in on that and analyzing my speech. I don't have to get frustrated that the device doesn't understand me or isn't doing the right thing. I can just talk naturally to someone else or record my thoughts or whatever, and the device can do some analysis on that.
Let me just add a couple more elements. We've already talked about the connection between how, particularly in clinical applications, how we would interact with a clinical center like a Hackensack Meridian to develop these, validate the technology, develop the technology, but also demonstrate its usefulness within the processes that currently form the interaction of the clinical teams and their patients. That's one element. And the other element is that the practical use of this is providing information in near real time. To do that, you have to have the array of technology from the capturing of it and the processing of it, and then the return of that information all along a path that is compliant with how clinical centers currently handle that type of data, which means confidential way of handling. We'd like to say HIPAA compliant, but it's broader than that. So those two elements are available today, but they're not easily achievable. So it takes time to get there. And so the application of this overall is a combination of these four areas, the two that Jeff mentioned, and the combination of the work that we do with clinical centers along with the technology that enables it in a seamless way to be practical within those centers.
Great. So one last thought here, and clearly, I guess pun intended, this is not the last word on speech tech in healthcare, right? We're really just getting started, and this could go on. But because again, because Sandra, you're kind of where the rubber meets the road, right? What are some of the things you're most focused on right now, over say the next year or so, that will give you the bang for the buck from an outcome standpoint and moving the ball forward in this space? And that's how we'll end things today.
Yeah, I think for us, what's really a key area of focus is particularly those areas that we know we fall short, and where democratization of access becomes a critical thing. So for example, one one of the things that we're very focused in on is improving quality. And part of that is focused in on readmission reduction, for example. How can I use speech technology and what device somebody may have easy access to and feel comfortable talking into, because they already do it, to leverage new and unique ways to potentially provide early intervention. Having said that, outside of the clinical arena, it's about access. And so how do we leverage speech technology to make it easier for patients to choose us, to find us? And that to me is a lot of either mobile applications where they can speak in, and it's truly a marketing strategy from that perspective. When you think of it from an access perspective, how do we make sure that we can make it easy for people to access the delivery system, whatever element that they're looking for, and help guide them to the appropriate element? I think those are the two areas in particular that we're going to focus a lot of our effort on in the next couple of years.
Fantastic. Well, it is, yeah, that democratization of access combined with the acceleration of technology, which, you know, in this field clearly is exponential, right? This is,
yep.
Things are moving forward very, very quickly. And, you know, when we have this conversation in 2 years, a lot of things we're talking about now are going to be in place and will be commonplace. And so I greatly appreciate all three of you giving your time today, and hopefully providing, I know from my perspective, very educational, and letting us really think about how we can leverage such a basic human function as speech to really transform healthcare. So thank you again, all three of you. Thank you to the audience, and we'll speak to everyone soon. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.